Okay, I just wanted to return to this. So we just discussed breast cancer on the previous slide. Go ahead and take a look at this. Once again, you can expand on it and you can see the answers to it. The answer is answer four. Um, there's basically that 50 to 80% lifetime risk of developing breast cancer. Colorectal cancer is another one that is definitely environmental and genetic. It's second only to lung cancer in the number of deaths occurring annually in the US. It's 2 to 3 times higher in that general population with one affected first degree relative. So anytime you see that where they have a first degree relative with colorectal cancer, we're more aggressive with screening in that patient. Tends to clusters in families. So once again, the genetic link there. There is another factor that's it's much more severe than just a genetic link there, essentially. It's adenomatous polyposis, which basically is a genetic mutation, essentially, where they have a huge rate of polyps, essentially. And these patients are at very, very high risk of developing cancer. Essentially, they will turn into cancer. So obviously, if you have a family history of this, they're going to be very aggressive with these patients. These patients are at super high risk for colorectal cancer, and they'll develop tons of polyps in the colon, essentially. So obviously, too, when we just think about general colorectal cancers, we have to look at things too, like environment, like high-fat diet, low fiber diet as well. Prostate cancer is another one that runs in families. It's the second most common diagnosed cancer in men after skin cancer, and it's second only to lung cancer as the cause of cancer death in men. We have a lot of new treatments out for prostate cancer, but once again, it does tend to run in families. So if there's a first degree relative that has it, they're at higher risk. Heterozygosity essentially is where there's not a multitude of different genetic traits that are contributing to development. So over, in certain regions, it's kind of been narrowed down essentially to certain genes that are causing prostate cancer. High-fat diet is a risk factor for prostate cancer. So once again, we do a lot of screening for this. We do PSA testing in men. We also do digital rectal exams for prostate enlargement. So once again, a lot of these disease states, like if you think about it, we always check the prostate. We do mammograms. We do colorectal screening, through colonoscopy. So this is why we do all those screening factors as well. Cancer gene identification, just real brief. Nowadays too, there's like the whole human genome sequencing. There's a lot of different development and research on DNA. I'm sure you're well aware of that, even in like pharmacogenetics. There's a lot of different treatments that we're actually tailoring with DNA sequencing. So a lot of times too with cancers, there's a lot of genes that are mutated, and some are primary causes of cancer, where some of them are not necessarily primary, and they just contribute to it with the development of, environment or lifestyle factors. Another disease state is diabetes. There's type 1, type 2. It's very complex and it's not fully understood. But obviously diabetes has very significant implications for other systems, like your eyes, and they're at, risk for retinopathy and blindness. Heart disease, they're at significant risk for heart disease and vascular disease. Kidney failure, damage to the kidneys essentially with it. There's two obviously types, and I'm sure there's type 1, type 2. Type 1 is insulin dependent. Type 1 is autoimmune. Once again, we're going to talk about this as we move into endocrine. But right now, like I said, these are things that you have to keep in your mind that are very genetic, that you really want to look at in your patient's history. So type 1 is autoimmune destruction. So it's an autoimmune process that basically attacks those pancreatic beta cells. T cell infiltration basically is part of your immune system that does the damage essentially with it. Individuals with type 1 are obviously need insulin for life. They are not producing any insulin essentially. Siblings, so once again, genetic, of individuals with type 1, they have a substantial elevated risk. The incidence is higher in offspring of diabetic fathers, so there's been a link there too with the male as well. Once going back to those twin studies, monozygotic and dizygotic pairs, they have a 30 to 50% and 5 to 10% increased risk respectively. So once again, you see that genetic link there. There's also an association with like an HLA allele, which HLAs are essentially genetic components that are heavily, or they heavily function within your immune system or your adaptive immune response, as well as immune recognition. But there is, you inherit specific HLA alleles, and depending on which ones you have, you can increase risk of certain diseases. So there may be, just for diabetes, there's a certain allele, HLA allele, that contributes to risk, or even like we talk about, like spondyloarthropathies, which are the back or the spine. They have an HLA genetic component that you can actually draw in their blood work to see if they're at risk. So there is one that goes alongside with type 1 diabetes. There is an insulin gene. I don't expect you to memorize these. I just want to get the point across that there's a genetic link there. Type 2 diabetes. So once again, this is more of the adult onset. More than 90% of individuals with diabetes have type 2. So it's very common, much more common than type 1. And there's not an autoimmune process there. This is not like type 1. Type 1 is where your body has an autoimmune response and you're destroying that pancreatic beta cell. So this is different. This is more insulin resistance, and then they have diminished production of insulin. But once again, this is heavily related to those risk factors in the environment: obesity, a genetic link with positive family history. Exercise obviously prevents or has a preventative effect on it as well. There's higher reoccurrence risk if you have, with monozygotic twins. First-degree relatives, there's a huge risk for the patient, if they have a first-degree relative that has it as well. These are just different genes. I don't expect you to memorize these. Once again, just trying to get the point across that this is what happens. But, it's interesting because there's the glucokinase gene. I feel like I've seen over, I don't know, the past 10 years or whatever, 8 to 10 years, a lot of type 2 diabetes that are young and patients that you wouldn't really expect it with. And, it's almost like a cross between a type 1 and type 2. So it's almost like a maturity onset, diabetes of the young. So you're getting it both ways. Like, we have kids that are getting, diabetes and stuff like that. Type 2 diabetes, not type 1, so it's changed a lot. You can go ahead and take a look at this. Once again, it's just a question. Expand on it, and you can read the bottom of it as well. The answer is 4. And once again, it's about lifestyle modification. So those areas that we have to work on with our patients. Obesity, there's, a genetic link there too. So it's defined as anything with a BMI over 30. Once again, it puts them at risk for other disease factors: heart disease, stroke, cancer, type 2 diabetes. There is a genetic link there, like when they did adoption studies and twin studies. There's genetic links with leptin, which basically leptin's a hormone that's secreted by adipose tissue, and it actually binds with receptors in your hypothalamus, in which basically in turn your hypothalamus is what kind of regulates or stimulates your appetite essentially. So there's actually been genes with leptin. So there is a genetic component there too with obesity as well. Alzheimer's disease is another one that you'll hear very commonly discussed with environmental factors as well as family. I'm sure you pretty much know or have heard about it. They have amyloid plaques and neurofibrillary tangles. There's a significant risk if there's a first-degree relative. Once again, I don't expect you to memorize these different, genes or anything like that. But there is a genetic link there as well. And once again, if you look at the bottom too with those mutations for late onset AD, those alleles, if they have 1 copy, 2 copies, they're basically at higher risk depending on how many copies of that, abnormal allele or mutation that they have essentially with it. And, going back to like when we were talking about stress and disease, like Alzheimer's has had a lot too, like there's been a lot of studies on stress and Alzheimer's disease, development or progression. And one of them is like sleep. Like they've had a lot of studies done on, lack of sleep and progression of dementia as well. So there's a lot of like different little environmental risk factors that we got to think about. And that's why we talk to our patients about a lot of things like that. Alcoholism has a heavy family history as well. It's 3 to 5 times higher in an individual with an alcoholic parent. Once again, looking at adoption studies. So offspring of an alcoholic parent, even when raised by a non-alcoholic parent, have a 4-fold risk or increased risk So once again, that's genetic. Offspring of non-alcoholic patients when reared by alcoholic parents do not have a risk. So it's kind of interesting. It's more so genetic than it is environmental, essentially, when when you're looking at it from this perspective. Monozygotic and dizygotic twins, 60 and 30% respectively increased risk. I don't expect you to memorize the numbers by any means. It's just want you to get the concept. Different genes, individuals with a HLDH2 allele are much less likely to become alcoholics. So it's almost a protective mechanism there. Because once again, there's also genetic components that are protective or tumor suppressor genes. So if they don't have it, then they're more, they're at risk essentially. Schizophrenia, so a lot of mental health disorders, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, those have a genetic link there too. So reoccurrence recurrence risk is among offspring to one affected parent is 10 times higher than the general population. So that's pretty significant. Same thing if they have an affected sibling and an affected parent, they have a 20% risk. So that's high. So, when you're, like I said at the beginning, when you're thinking about like differential diagnoses in your mind as you move through other classes and you look at their family history, it kind of helps you narrow things down and figure out, okay, like, is this possible? Do they possibly have this? It just kind of helps with your critical thinking and your clinical reasoning essentially there. If they have two affected parents, the risk is 50%. That's high, very high. So once again, the genetic link there. Same thing with bipolar. It's high with first-degree relatives compared with those that do not have a first-degree relative. Same thing with major depression. There's a genetic link there. And, like I said, there's a lot of genes that we don't know about yet. But there's genes that can affect serotonin, dopamine, noradrenaline. So there's a lot of different areas here. Schizophrenia and bipolar disease. There's numerous genetic components and environmental factors. So it's really hard to figure out exactly what is triggering it, if that makes sense. Because, like I said, there can be multiple areas of genetics or multiple environmental factors that can cause the onset of disease. So obviously there's other complex disorders as well. Many are being studied still, and genomics is a huge area. I'm sure you're well aware of that. Even, patients are even, well aware of it. And, nowadays they want genetic testing and it's becoming more and more common. So you'll hear more about it. General principles of complex disorders. The more strongly inherited forms of complex disorders generally have an earlier age of onset. Stronger presentation, they tend to have that earlier age of onset. Those often represent the single gene inheritance. The sex-specific threshold model fits some of the disorders like pyloric stenosis, autism, heart disease, but it doesn't fit all of them. So, it's on a one-size-fit-all thing. But it's just to get you thinking of like, okay, you want to know who's at higher risk and, what are the implications of that, essentially, like when we talked about the very beginning with pyloric stenosis. So the assumption that genetic components means the course of disease cannot be altered is incorrect. So that's obviously incorrect. We want to make sure that we're targeting those modifiable risk factors and targeting those environmental areas that we can, alter essentially so that they don't have the onset of disease. Identifying those genetic lesions essentially can lead to more effective prevention and treatment of disorders is absolutely true. Like you think about the polyps and the genetic component there where will essentially institute colorectal screening at a much younger age because we know that they have that genetic risk there. So really it leads to better prevention and treatment essentially. And our treatments can be targeted to genetic factors as well. So really this is an area that you'll definitely hear more about. And we'll talk about this as we move through, each disease process as well. So right now, like I said, it's just to kind of understand which ones are really prominent with the genetic component and environment and just kind of getting those general concepts with it. So if you have questions, obviously, please let me know. I'm always happy to help. And I hope you have a great day. Thank you.